Okay, so you guys really seem to enjoy the videos that we've been making on these different characters becoming heralds of Galactus. And I think it's also because it kind of gives you guys perspective into the stories that Marvel gives to aspiring writers. This is Moon Knight becoming a herald of Galactus. This is written by Alex Segura, and this guy's actually kind of made the rounds, right? He's an award-winning novelist, and he's written some stories in DC and a few stories in Marvel, but nothing on a grandiose scale, right? They were just little one-shot stories from Spider-Verse or little things like that. So this is kind of him stepping into a much bigger role when it comes to writing at Marvel. And we'll see how you guys feel about it towards the end. But what this does is this initially picks up with a fight between the god Khonshu and Galactus. And it's kind of cool, right? We'll talk about why this is cool here in a second. But the fight kind of goes the way conventional wisdom would expect it to, right? When you think about Galactus as a cosmic entity, being this nigh all-powerful character, this guy makes pretty quick work of Khonshu. But the reason why they're fighting in the first place is because Galactus had arrived on Earth with the intention of forcing Khonshu to become his new herald. And you don't usually see Galactus forcing gods to become his herald. It doesn't usually work that way, right? Normally it's mortals, and that's done for two different reasons. The first is because it makes for a more compelling story, right? It's some dude who's been down on his luck his whole life suddenly gets the power cosmic and can do virtually anything, right? It's a rags to riches type story. But the second reason why is because gods are already incredibly powerful. If you give them the power cosmic, of course, they'll become even more powerful enough to potentially rival Galactus. So, if for no other reason than just self-preservation, he doesn't really give gods those powers. And so what ends up going on here is Khonshu, of course, has rejected this. He has no desire to serve as a herald of Galactus. And it kind of makes sense, right? Is Khonshu the most powerful god that exists? Even within Earth itself? No, there's elder gods way beyond Khonshu, but he does rule his little corner of the world, and he's perfectly content with it. Why screw around with being happy when you're already happy, right? The endless pursuit of happiness. And so ultimately, he's just kind of like, no, right? Plus, Khonshu is exceedingly prideful. So the idea of serving someone, no, Khonshu's simply not going to settle for that. And the result is that Galactus just ends up killing him. Now, it's not to say that Khonshu gets absolutely, tanked here. Not at all. Instead, like when he's fighting Galactus, he holds his own to a degree. And in fact, he inflicts pain on Galactus. Now, that's where the writing of Alex Segura really kind of seems to falter to a degree. And over the course of the story, as we get further and further towards the end, things are going to get kind of wonky. But Galactus's response to this, right? Like, what is this feeling? Is this pain? It feels a little cartoonish, right, in terms of how Galactus would be written. Truth to tell, Galactus being written as a character in Marvel Comics is the epitome of seemingly emotionless, right? I mean, Galactus doesn't really express like anger or rage or anything along those lines. He can, and sometimes he does, but it's contextual, right? It's usually because he's facing a force as powerful as himself, his life is on the line, or like you and I, when we're hangry, he just hasn't eaten for a while. But whatever the case happens to be, this kind of situation is not one where he would be emotional and certainly wouldn't be like, oh my God, is this feeling, is it pain, So again, not a harsh criticism of Segura's writing, but just a little room for improvement there. But the fact is, ultimately what Khonshu does is he sends out word to Moon Knight, right? And it's like, okay, I need you here, right? You need to avenge me. And so, of course, you switch over to Moon Knight himself. Now, at this point, he's in the Lower East Side down in New York City. There's some guy who is trying to snatch somebody else's, I guess, man purse, it looks like. I'm not 100% sure. But that's when Moon Knight steps in. And again, a little bit of deviation here from what we're familiar with when it comes to Mark Spector. The guy who tried to snatch the purse, Mark Spector talks about how he's going to hand him over to the cops. We know that's not what Moon Knight would do. Moon Knight would drag that man into a dark alley and then beat him within an inch of his life, put the fear of God in him, and that guy would immediately rethink his life and go get a job working at some company somewhere in a cubicle, right? Just on the straight and narrow. That dude would turn his life around in an instant. But such as it is, Mark Spector is hit by a kind of telepathic attack, so to speak, from Khonshu, sending out a message and saying, you need to come to where I am. Now, when Mark Spector gets there, this is particularly cool. And I love the way that this is done, right? He says, my eyes open and I'm somewhere else, far away, but also familiar. That's when I see it. I see him lying there, broken and beaten. Khonshu has never seemed more human. And he says, and just like that, he's gone. Few things are more unnerving than witnessing the death of a god. One of those things, however, is looking right at me. Now, one of the things that I do love about Alex Segura's writing in this story is the monologue of Moon Knight. It is amazing. Like the way that Moon Knight talks, just the way he communicates his own thoughts is awesome. Now, of course, Galactus shows up on the scene here, right? Khonshu is dead. I am Galactus and I hunger. Your misguided god rebuked my call. The privilege of being my herald, few have survived such an experience. Yet he summons you, a mortal man, a dealer in violence and vengeance. What can you say, Mark Spector, that might convince me to spare this planet? For Galactus must feed. Now, one of the things that I do want to talk about here for a second, before we get into this conversation between Galactus and Moon Knight, is the nature of gods battling each other. I mean, if we were doing power scaling and we were just kind of cooking the books to guarantee a predetermined outcome, then sure, we could say, okay, you know, like Galactus going against Dormammu, Galactus defeated Dormammu, Dormammu's clearly above Khonshu, therefore Galactus is more powerful than Khonshu. But when it comes to this idea of gods within the realm of Marvel, it is anything but linear. It is anything but a kind of straight hierarchy. You try to make the best of it as you can, but the ability to create hierarchies between gods is really more due to the feats that Marvel's displayed than anything else, which I guess in and of itself is kind of power scaling. We're just not going to cook the books to get the outcome that we want. So I'll simply just say that, like, this could have gone either way, because if this was like Chthon, for example, right? If we're talking about old school Roy Thomas, Doctor Strange, Sorcerer Supreme number 24 Chthon, right? Where like Dormammu draws on Chthon's power in order to face off against a foe, then sure, Chthon may have been able to defeat Galactus, or maybe he would not have. It really all just kind of comes down to the writer. And I know it's not the answer people are looking for, right? Whenever it comes to power scaling, people are like, I want a definitive answer on who would win. But if we're being honest, there really is rarely ever a straight answer when it comes to these things. But I kind of wanted to throw that out there and mention that. But the fact is that when this conversation goes down, Mark Spector has this really, really interesting idea. He says, then I understand why Khonshu summoned me, not to save him, but to save everyone else. I let Steve Grant, charming, convincing, wealthy, slide into the driver's seat, and then I pray. Now, the personalities of Mark Spector are going to play a role in this story. And it's really awesome the way it goes down, because the Steve Grant personality does exactly what you would expect him to, with his silver tongue, tells Galactus, well, I mean, look, I'm the perfect guy to be your herald, right? You know, truth to tell, I love travel. I love seeing things, right? The reality is, why settle for these small, paltry things when I can have a proper feast? As your herald, I can see things that I never would have been able to see before. And I can serve you in a way that will spare my planet from your wrath and will allow you to feast, right? Because my ability to travel feeds directly in to what it is that you want to do. And ever the sly guy here, Steve Grant, seems to get one over on Galactus. And Galactus is like, cool, you become my new herald. Now, I will say the appearance of Moon Knight as a herald of Galactus looks amazing. And I'm really hoping they put this costume in Marvel Rivals, and potentially a new power set that really requires Moon Knight to do more than just throw his daggers at an Ankh that's sitting on the ground. But the fact is, right, it looks phenomenal. I love the design of this costume. Now, the other part of this, for some of you more eagle-eyed people, you may be asking yourselves, well, if Galactus is all powerful, Galactus has, you know, incredible levels of telepathy, stuff like that, wouldn't he know that Mark Spector is lying to him, right? That he's manipulating him? And under normal circumstances, yes. And if this were like anybody else in Marvel, I would say, sure, right? That's true. But Galactus, and the way that Alex Segura nails this is phenomenal. Galactus is a guy that in a lot of ways kind of gets caught up in his own hype. He sees everybody as being below him. And whether it's arrogance or just the recognition of his place within the cosmos, he doesn't really consider the idea that people may try to like trick him or deceive him or something like that. Or it could simply just be one of these things that because a herald is imbued with less power than Galactus, if the herald is lying and if they end up turning against Galactus, he just takes the cosmic power away from them and then just goes somewhere else and finds a new herald. So there's any number of reasons for why it is that Galactus could effectively be quote unquote hoodwinked by Mark Spector. Maybe he knows Spector's lying and he doesn't care. That kind of answer has been given to us over the years in Marvel. John Byrne's given an answer, Roy Thomas has given an answer, Dan Jurgens has given different answers, right? And it really kind of depends on what era of Marvel Comics you're reading when it comes to the character of Galactus, especially Walter Simonson. He was really good at dancing around that whole thing. But the bigger point is that at that moment, Mark Spector feels the power cosmic flowing through him, but feels untethered at the same time. Because for us as people residing here on Earth, the recognition that we can't really fly away from the planet and leave kind of brings a sense of grounding to us, right? We are here. This is the only planet that we can currently occupy that we know of. I don't know. Conspiracy theory, but we can't go anywhere else. So we make home here as best we can. The connections that we forge, the friendships that we make, the people we fall in love with, fall out of love with, that all builds the house upon this land with which we as humanity reside. But when you're someone like Mark Spector, who's to a degree always kind of been a loner, and then suddenly you're imbued with the power cosmic, you can fly through the universe at record speed. You see all things happening at one moment in time, assuming he reaches that level of understanding his power cosmic. There is a lot of power that comes with that, but then there's the sudden feeling of being unattached to anything. And there is a feeling of free falling that comes with that. And Mark Spector is experiencing that firsthand. The problem is that right out of the gate, before he's even able to really gain understanding of how the power cosmic works, he's met by the fallen heralds of Galactus. Now, this is not the fallen one, right? That guy is on a whole different level. This is just some of the other heralds of Galactus that have either rejected him or were cast out as his heralds. But you've got Terrax the Tamer, Silver Surfer, Frankie Ray, and Firelord. Now, each one of these guys are immensely powerful in their own right. Of course, Silver Surfer is the most popular of all of these. And then depending on what era of comics you come from, either Frankie Ray or Firelord are the more popular ones. Terrax is usually down there somewhere, right, that most people are aware of but don't really know a whole lot about. And while we don't have to go in and out as far as all their different origins and stuff, they are all incredibly powerful. Understand, each one of these guys is enough to take on the Avengers full stop. With the exception of maybe the Incredible Hulk, they would dominate these guys. But here's the cool thing that goes on here. Mark Spector doesn't initially know how to approach this. Through the power cosmic and his own experiences, he's aware of these guys, so he knows who the Silver Surfer is. And even Silver Surfer himself is just like, I know this guy, right? Like, I mean, we've fought side by side before, but they unleash their attack anyway. Now, most likely, this is just kind of a preemptive strike, right? Whenever Galactus shows up with a new herald, each one of them understands that Galactus is sending that herald out to destroy worlds. So they're likely fighting for the preservation of life. Contextually, it almost makes them look like villains, but they're most likely not. The funny thing about this is that with Mark Spector, he says, my mind drifts away. I feel my powers flowing through me, but just out of reach. The rush of power is gone, brought crashing to Earth by beings to whom this is like a changing of clothes. I feel myself become unraveled, and I hear a voice, Khonshu's voice, in my mind, in all of my minds. And he says, embrace it. Embrace it, my fist. Fall back into yourself. Let each of you take hold and strike out. And so what ends up happening is the different personalities of Mark Spector start to manifest, and each one uses the power cosmic. The caveat to this is that each personality uses the power cosmic in a different way. And so in effect, Silver Surfer, Firelord, and Frankie Ray, and Terrax, they're basically facing off against 3 enemies in 1. And there's no telling how it is that these guys are going to use the power cosmic. Now, Is it enough for him to quote unquote destroy the heralds? No, not at all. But it is enough for him to momentarily overpower them and then take off. And that's when he starts to put the pieces together. That when Galactus transformed him into his herald, Galactus took the powers of all the other heralds and put them into Mark Spector. And that kind of gives Spector credence into believing that Galactus knows about his multiple personalities, that he knows that he's got a fractured mind. But at the end of the day, it makes no real difference from the story's perspective, because when Mark Spector kind of has to regain himself, right, travel back to Earth, meet with the people that he knows, kind of reground himself, he knows that traveling across the cosmos and killing on such a scale is wrong, right? Like taking Galactus to worlds and enabling Galactus to wipe out those entire worlds and kill all the life on it. He can't bring himself to do it. Even someone like Moon Knight has morals, as crazy as that statement sounds. But when he arrives on Earth, he realizes he didn't just travel to Earth, he traveled forward in time. Now, that is actually a power of the Silver Surfer. It is a far lesser known power, but it's a power that he used to have back in the day when Roy Thomas was writing his character. Silver Surfer used to travel in time. Like, it wasn't that uncommon. For those of you guys who aren't aware of Silver Surfer's history, there was a time in Marvel Comics where that guy was stupidly overpowered. I mean, just next level OP. Silver Surfer was nuts. He still wasn't as powerful as Galactus, so you could probably extrapolate how powerful Galactus was back then. But Silver Surfer's abilities were insane. The ability to alter reality, time travel. In some ways, he was like a less powerful walking, talking Infinity Gauntlet. It was nuts, the kind of stuff that guy could do. I do miss those stories, man. Everybody was more powerful back then. Thanos was more powerful. Silver Surfer was more powerful. I mean, hell, like when Susan Storm was Malice, she was more powerful during the John Byrne run. Like, I do miss all those things. I miss the 70s and 80s when characters were just broken, right? It was absolutely nuts. But still, right, when Mark Spector arrives here on Earth after traveling forward through time, he realizes Galactus has already hit Earth, right? He's already attacked it. Now, it's not one of these things where he attacked Earth because, he sent Mark Spector out and Galactus lied and consumed Earth the moment that Mark Spector was gone. Instead, Galactus kept his word, right? He was like, I will not attack your world so long as you do your job as a herald. But if you don't, I will come after Earth and I will destroy everyone that you've ever loved, and I will destroy the planet itself. And so seemingly in this time skip that Mark Spector experienced, Galactus did exactly that. In the absence of Spector, Galactus assumed Spector abandoned him, and Galactus went after Earth. And while we don't really get any kind of a huge drawn out fight between any of the superheroes on Earth and Galactus, we do just kind of get like this little news blip that comes from the Daily Bugle, right? Alien powerhouse decimates the Avengers, Fantastic Four, and the X-Men. And so when you see Galactus here, this is where things get a little bit wonky. And the reason why is because when it comes to Galactus, he has three unofficial forms. You have Galactus when he's fully fed and at his most powerful, which is usually when it's easiest to be ignored by Galactus, right? He has no reason to come after you unless you really, really piss him off. Then you have like baseline Galactus, right? He's driving around hunting for a meal, not quite sure what he wants to eat. But then you have hungered Galactus, starving Galactus. That's when he's at his most dangerous, and he will go after anybody. It doesn't matter. If they are an energy source that can, in some capacity, satiate his hunger, he will consume you. And there'll be no arguing that, right? There'll be no debating that. Unless you're powerful enough to overcome him, you are going to die. Now, there are instances when Galactus in a starved state is not depicted personality-wise the way you normally see him. But even in a starved state, you don't really see him written the way you see him written here. If anything, Galactus in a starved state is more ferocious. He fights with a greater level of tenacity than he does in just a regular state. And so I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your head as you go through this, because when Mark Spector arrives and Galactus confronts him, he's just like, you have failed me, you have failed your planet, and Galactus will literally strip you of your power and then feed on Earth. And that's where Spector's just like, no, that's not going to happen. And Galactus says there is no force within light years that would dare impede me. And that's where Mark says, that's where you're wrong, Galactus, because I'm right here. And immediately Galactus attacks him. And initially, the way Galactus talks here is kind of the way that you would expect him to talk, right? When he's just exceedingly pissed off and incredibly hungry, right? He says, "You surprise me. You've learned to master your abilities faster than I could have hoped. But no matter, a nothing gifted with feeble powers is still nothing." But then he turns around and he's like, "Who dares?" Right? And becomes very like human in terms of how he interacts. And Galactus is a very inhuman being, because that's when he kind of starts throwing out these like quips and one-liners, little things like that, right? Where you have like the other heralds who show up to help Mark Spector. And Galactus says, "Ah, my fallen heralds, desperate for clout, desperate for proof, they weren't just fleeting tools of my own making, more fodder for Galactus." And so again, right, he's very, very human in terms of how he acts. Now, Alex Segura does kind of recover this to a degree in the fight that goes on between Galactus and his other heralds, where the statement's made that he's effectively gone crazy, right? He's essentially gone mad. But again, Galactus doesn't really go mad. If you want to see a story where Galactus starts eradicating everything across the cosmos, and he's seemingly going on a warpath, that's actually the Doctor Doom one-shot from Jonathan Hickman. We covered it. I'll post a link to it at the end of this. But like, Doctor Doom is the last being standing in the universe where Galactus is traveling the cosmos, wiping out everything in existence, all the superheroes, consuming all sentient life, so on and so forth. And there's a really cool ending to that I won't spoil here, but that's when you really see Galactus just sort of losing his mind, traveling across the cosmos. But it's more his actions that show that he's going crazy, as opposed to his personal mannerisms. Now, you may love this, but you may absolutely adore the way that Galactus is being written here. I'm not here to argue either way. But the fact is, right, he's very human in how he interacts, because he says, "Who would have guessed, Frankie Ray, that you, my human herald, would be the wisest of them all?" And that comes off the heels of her making the statement that, like, there really isn't much that they could do against him, that they're all basically done for. And so where he goes to take the Silver Surfer and actually destroys the Silver Surfer on the spot, Mark Spector attacks him, right? And in turn, Galactus turns and is like, "You must be joking." There is a little comedy that goes into this, I'm not gonna lie. And it's not terrible, right? But again, like Mark Spector giving this kind of inner monologue, he says, "I want to say something quippy, sharp, and cutting. Joke's on you," or "Who's laughing now, Galactus?" But it's taking every shred of power I have to keep myself together, to channel all my powers into one being, into one mind, literally controlling all of its personalities and gaining the full totality of its powers. And he says, "I'm only going to get one shot at this. I can only muster one shot. For Khonshu, for Marlene and Frenchie, for my city, and for my planet." And so he fires a shot at Galactus. He says, "For myself and everything that makes up Mark Spector, Jake Lockley, Stephen Grant." For a brief second, I can hear Marlene whispering in my ear, "You did it. I knew you could." But as quickly as this all started, it ends, because the attack on Galactus didn't work. And you wouldn't expect it to, right? I mean, Galactus rarely ever makes the heralds equal to himself. The only herald that I'm aware of that was that close to Galactus's power was the Fallen One. And Galactus literally locked him away, seemingly for all eternity, until I think Thanos accidentally let him out, or something along those lines, or Thanos wanted to fight him, or something to that effect. We can cover that story if you're interested. Like, literally, the story is just Thanos traveling around the universe, fighting all the most powerful beings in the universe, all the former heralds of Galactus. Let me know what you guys think, right? You can cover it if you really want. But the fact is, right, at that moment, instead of Galactus destroying everything in existence, Galactus is just kind of like, "Your planet, none of you are worthy of the effort of Galactus." And so he ultimately just walks away. He strips Moon Knight of his power and he leaves. And he says, "I will find sustenance in a loyal herald, one that appreciates the power cosmic and its demands." And so again, it's kind of a weird ending. You would think Galactus would have just destroyed the Earth and everybody, and maybe it's because of some measure of respect for Mark Spector. Maybe it's because the battle drained him so much that he can't. We don't really get a definitive answer here, but he basically just leaves. And in this last little tidbit, you end up finding out that Mark Spector actually still has a portion of the power cosmic. And who knows what it is he's going to do. Probably go back after Galactus again. Who knows? All these stories end on cliffhangers. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.